So I'm just, we're here until 4 o'clock, but we'll need to, I think, end by 10 off, so we have about a half an hour. So I just would like for people to, raise your hand, say your name. No speeches, just keep it to a question. Know that all opinions are very welcome here, and just be respectful of each other and leave space for other people who have questions as well. So Jeff, do you want to pick folks? Do you want me to help you with that?
Oh, if you
Okay. So, yes, so just say your name.
Kevin Farrer, I'm a member of East Bay Citizens for Peace. Jeff, I was curious, towards the end there, you had that slide up that talked about what Hamas did on October 7th. Do you not believe that that was a war crime? Taking hostages and such?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, but, again, there's a little more to it than that. Some of the people that we call hostages were military people, and they are prisoners of war, and some of the people that we call prisoners that are in Israeli jails are hostages in effect too. So there's more nuance. So people were murdered. Israelis were murdered on October 7th, without a doubt. Some may have been raped, but there's a lot of sensationalism about it that, again, in this framework of the natives are always the savages, and the Israelis are the civilized people. So we won't know the whole story, except we hope that eventually there'll be an inquiry in Israel, because the relatives of the people that were killed want to know what happened. And there certainly is some evidence that some of the initial crimes that were ascribed to the Palestinians were concocted. Not all of them, but some of them. And that some of them was lurid charges were invented or embroidered by the Israelis. So we don't know the full story, except that crimes were committed. Some of the Palestinians have committed crimes, just as all sides do in war. I don't think there's anything. What the propaganda is trying to create this idea that they are particularly savage, in the way they fight wars. And of course, all war is savage. And in the Israeli, what they call War of Independence, there are credible reports of rapes in villages, people being killed just the same way. And of course, even in our good war, in the Second World War, there are very credible accounts of people killing prisoners, rapes, and so on. It just it's why all war is bad. But this propaganda that the natives are particularly some especially savage thing, that's part of colonial war propaganda, to my mind.
Come on, you had your...
I got 2 questions. You showed a slide of Ron Bauer, you showed a slide of Roosevelt meeting with Basal.
Well, Abdulaziz was.
Yeah. It was. You had it dated as 1945. I understood Roosevelt died April 12, 1944.
He died in April 1945, and that was in February.
45.
Yeah, 45. Yeah.
Okay. And the other question was, I understood Israel was established. Truman recognized was the first. We were the first nation to recognize Israel as a sovereign state in 1948.
Yep.
And so the other question was there a connection between the description of what genocide was in 1948? Was that related to when Israel was established? Is there a relationship there in any way?
Not really. I mean, part of the background for why people supported Israel was the knowledge about the killing of the Jews in Europe, and it gave some legitimacy to the project of establishing a Jewish state that Truman cited as one of his motivations. But the Genocide Convention, obviously no one imagined that would ever be applied to Israel. So it was a separate thing. As part of this whole movement toward international law regarding war that was developed after the Second World War, after the Nuremberg trials and so on, it was part of that. And of course, the guy who invented the term was a Polish Jewish guy. And so it very much referenced what had happened, from the Nazis, but it was then universalized of genocide shouldn't happen to anybody. And so that's where things stand. Now, and theoretically, the Rome Court, the UN is supposed to, enforce these things, and there's the Rome statute that established the International Criminal Court that theoretically could prosecute people because of this genocide, but of course it hasn't yet. Israel's not a member, the US is not a member of that court either.
Thank you.
So, in the back?
Yeah, two things. Thank you. This is wonderful, very informative. I wondered, first of all, just before I forget, whether you passed around something so that we could get a copy maybe of the slide deck, if you're willing to share.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
If someone, I have it on a stick, memory stick. So if anyone wants to do that while we're here.
All right. That was one question, but that could be made available via email or something. And then the other question is, this deep concern about tunnels underneath the hospitals. And I'm thinking, the place is 7 miles wide, and where are they going to put their soldiers? And is there a place, is it a legitimate Gaza army that it would be legitimate to kill? I mean, I don't really see that they're allowed to. So I'm kind of confused about that whole, issue. Placing them under the hospital seems so heinous. You said terrible things.
The international law is difficult in this situation. I mean, in theory, Israel is recognized as the occupying power in Gaza. And of course it has the right of self-defense, but that doesn't include the right of operating militarily within the occupied territories. In theory, that contradicts international law on that. And the irony is that when Israel had the right and the duty of self-defense, they didn't do it. I mean, this was part of the contempt for the natives that a lot of colonial people have. Israel maintained a skeleton force around the outside of Gaza. And in fact, the military unit that was supposed to be stationed there was mostly deployed into the West Bank to defend the settlers at that time. So they had a skeleton force surrounding Gaza, when in fact they should have been defending themselves. And they never imagined that the natives were capable of organizing such an elaborate and skilled attack. Frankly, Hamas itself seems to have been a little surprised about how successful they were. And therefore, when people broke out, there was no central command anymore that was sort of giving orders to these people. Thousands of people streamed out of Gaza. Some of them were Hamas fighters, some were not. And as far as we can tell, whatever atrocities were committed, it was not part of central orders or central command. It was just stuff that happened. So within Gaza, Gaza is not a country, doesn't have an official army. It has fighters. Hamas has, nobody knows for sure, 20 to 30,000 fighters. And the idea that they are using the populace as human shields is sort of one of these tropes that's floated around. I mean, Gaza is an urbanized, dense area. You couldn't fight defensively without being intermingled with the civilian population. And of course, in every urban warfare, that's what happens historically. So the idea that somehow they should be all gathered fields outside of Gaza and say, okay, bomb us, I mean, it's kind of absurd. So when Israel determines that they want to eradicate Gaza, it's not an accident, it's an intent that thousands of civilians will be killed because it's a densely populated urban area. And if you're dropping 2,000-pound bombs to kill a single Hamas commander in the middle of a refugee camp, even if you do that, you're going to kill hundreds of others, which of course has been the pattern that's happened. And there are tunnels all under Gaza. Somehow this is regarded as something sinister. Well, what else are you going to do if you're trying to develop a military force, sort of stay on rooftops waving, targets on your head? Of course they're digging underground. And some of those are in civilian neighborhoods and near or even possibly under hospitals. But the idea that Israel has charged that somehow they're using hospitals, for example, as headquarters, secret headquarters, none of that has been proven at all. In fact, it's been disproven. They have not been able to provide any evidence of that whatsoever, except a few staged videos that were up briefly on Twitter and then removed because people laughed at it, how ridiculous it was. So Israel, under international law, Israel doesn't have a right of self-defense by reconquering Gaza. It has the right of self-defense, which they, didn't do before October 7th. So that's the theory. They may have killed a few thousand Hamas fighters, possibly. We We don't know. But even by their own count, they've killed, many more times civilians than fighters. So by definition, it's a war crime. You can't kill 9 civilians to get 1 fighter. It's just not allowed.
Now, I have a question. Is there a path to justice?
So we can imagine lots of scenarios.
Yeah.
The path to a just peace in Palestine goes through Washington, D.C. And without a change in U.S. policy toward Israel, that is the unconditional support for Israel militarily, diplomatically, and politically, they have no incentive to make the compromises that they don't want to make. And whether that includes allowing the establishment of a truly sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, or some kind of arrangement to have a single multinational state, I mean, it's not for us to determine the outcome. None of that will be possible as long as the United States is unconditionally backing Israel to the hilt. And they have very little incentive to make those kinds of compromises as long as they can count on Uncle Sam to have their backs, including the annual $4 billion or so of military aid, and another $14 billion now, which is in Congress to arm them. And this is not as it's presented, oh, we have to help Israel defend itself. Israel is a rich country by world standards. It has a per capita GDP that's higher than most European countries. So the issue is not, they can defend themselves all they want, of course. The issue is, who pays for it? Israeli taxpayers or American taxpayers? If it was Israeli taxpayers that had to pay for it, frankly, there'd be some interest in compromising on what they're doing, because it's not accurate to say that Israel is just, by definition, always defending itself. Israel carries out policies that require high military expenditure. It has attacked every one of its neighbors at one time or another. It is repressing a Palestinian population. All of that costs money and military effort. If they had to pay the full freight for it, maybe they would think again. Maybe they would be more willing to compromise. But without that, nothing is going to improve. And without the really hypocritical cries in Washington among the Democrats, the Republicans now are totally good with Israel keeping control from the river to the sea. The Democrats often say, oh, they really want a two-state solution, but here's another $14 billion to support your military. I mean, does that make sense? Some of you have children. When your children misbehave, you don't raise their allowance. It's not a good strategy for encouraging good behavior.
I see. Thank you. There's some other questions. Randy?
Yeah, thanks for this talk. Did a good job of showing why people thought it was okay to establish Israel and why that was inevitably going to lead to a lot of really bad things. I have 2 questions. First, you did say that there is a right of resistance, but you also said elsewhere in your talk that I think you said more or less that the resistance is automatically going to lead to atrocities, because that's what happens in war. Does that affect the scope of the right of resistance, and if so, how much? Second question is, you said when you were discussing the early Zionists, you said that they saw those who are now Palestinians as natives. Did they actually use that term, and
yes.
Do you have a reference? So those are 2 questions.
They not only use that term, I mean, there were 2 things. Sometimes they denied that there was anybody living there. You know, remember the famous thing, land without a people for a people without a land. But people who actually went to Palestine understood that it was heavily populated by native people. So in the terminology of the early Zionist movement, they talked about colonization, Jewish colonization and Jewish colonies in Palestine. Of course, this, is sort of not very legitimate in modern parlance, but in, the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, this was normal. And they certainly used that terminology. They understood they were colonizing someone else's land. I mean, they thought they had the deed to it from the Hebrew Bible, but they understood that, practically speaking, somebody else lived there and they were going to take it over. So, what was the other part of your question?
The other question was, since you implied that the right of resistance would lead to atrocities, does that affect the scope of the right of resistance?
No, because you have to, you know, it's like, you know, there can be just wars, but there can be atrocities committed. What there needs to be is accountability. If there were ever a serious international legal system, charges would be brought against perpetrators of war crimes on either side. But in practice, as we know from Nuremberg, it's only the losers that get charged with war crimes. That's just the way it works, because the winners are not willing to submit to that. So in an ideal world, there should be an international investigation of what happened in Gaza on October 7th and after, and people who committed crimes should be brought to justice, whether they're Palestinians or Israelis. That's unlikely to happen, mainly because the U.S. and Israel oppose any independent investigation whenever there are charges of war crimes committed by Israel. So it's not likely to happen because it's voluntary. You know, living up to the principles of international law and the laws of war is voluntary, in effect. So they don't have to do it.
Question over here.
Why? Why do we keep supporting Israel in light of all you've said?
So, you know, there's a number of reasons. One of which, especially, was, you know, active during the Cold War, was as the Cold War was, you know, carried out in the Middle East, the U.S. military and political people thought that Israel was an important ally, a kind of staging area for U.S. power in the Middle East. Of course, since 1948 and to the present, there's an important and powerful political lobby that supports Israel, that has an effect on our elections, and it is becoming more, as persuasion becomes more and more difficult, sheer money and political muscle is becoming more prominent. So AIPAC, which you've all heard of, it's the American Israel Political Affairs Committee. And it's not a PAC under U.S. law, nor is it a registered foreign agent as under our law, but it effectively is the lobby for Israel's interests in the United States. And they are able to deploy a lot of grassroots pressure, a lot of money, and for instance, just in the last several electoral cycles, AIPAC has established its own political action committee that has spent millions of dollars and is threatening to spend $100 million or more to defeat that small band of Democrats that's willing to criticize Israel. They're all Democrats and they're all people of color. And Pressy is one, you know, and so on. So political power and money plays a role, and of course now repression. You know, pro-Israel people are very prominent in our institutions, and you wouldn't think they could make the president of Harvard kneel and beg for forgiveness, but you know, that's an indication of how much power. Not that I'm a big fan of Harvard, but Harvard is a powerful institution in our country, and the fact that the president of Harvard was forced to bend the knee to Israel is a sign of political power. And people are losing their job, being blacklisted, afraid to speak up on this issue, and you know, the media is very sympathetic to Israel, you know, and part of it is inertia. You know, back when we were young, most of you are a little like I am, Israel had this kind of progressive image, right? Because, I mean, it's sad to say, right, we didn't look at the natives in those days very much. So Israel was this wonderful pioneering, you know, enterprise, kibbutzes and socialism was a progressive thing. And it was never particularly true then, and certainly became less and less true, but it has a kind of inertia to it. So that there's still a sort of happy feeling about Israel, about what Israel represents, especially for old people. And it's old people that run our government, unfortunately. That attitude has been lost to younger people who grew up in a different era and have more access to information. So the younger generation has been lost to Israel and Israel supporters. And that's why they're waging this campaign of repression against universities. They can't win them over, but they can maybe beat them down, and that's what's going on now.
We have, do you still have your question? You already answered.
He just answered.
Okay, so there's a woman in the back.
Well, I wanted to ask about the universities, because I'm kind of appalled about what's happening. I mean, not because they're Ivies and whatever, just that these heads of school, very diverse schools, are trying to keep an even, I think, keep an even keel and let people voice what they need to voice, as long as it's not violent. And I find it kind of horrifying that the government is like, you can't do that, and how dare you, and succumb, and to me it's kind of gross, because it really is all about money and power, and I just, you already answered my
So
question, you
it's stunning,
spoke
but
about it, but.
let me put it in context a little bit. So you might have followed, you know, 3 presidents, 2 Ivy and MIT presidents were called to testify before Congress.
All women.
And they were grilled by this right-wing Republican congressperson. You probably have saw, you know, that video clip, you might have seen it, who is a Trumpy right-wing person. And the way she framed it, she said that calls for intifada, which is revolution basically, and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, those are genocidal sentiments. And therefore, don't you condemn genocide? And the stupid, you would think they would be smart enough to say, wait a minute, we don't accept that this is a call for genocide. Nobody is on college campuses saying, kill the Jews, bring back Auschwitz. They're saying, which students always say, they're saying revolution and freedom for Palestine. And they accepted this framing of this person that said this was genocide. Are you defending genocide? So this is the way it was reported. Are you not condemning genocide? And they, for supposedly smart people, they totally flubbed it. Because they were, you know, under a lot of pressure and, you know, just really frightened. And so they are begging for forgiveness now. And there are calls for their dismissal at MIT and Columbia and UPenn. And of course, money is playing a role too. Someone who had pledged $100 million to the University of Pennsylvania said he's not giving it now. And then money talks in this society.
It does, but I don't think they should back down.
No, I don't think so either.
It's just gross. It's gross to me, you know?
Okay, but it's an illustration of the power that Israel's supporters of the United States have, political and financial. And it's not to be sneezed at. And when people who otherwise are very privileged and powerful people have to genuflect to it, that's an example, that's an illustration of who's got the real power.
So I think we can take one more question. Oh, we'll take 2. Bob, you had a question, and then Martha will be the last one.
I know Human Rights Watch was already blasting Israel before October 7th. And my concern really is the West Bank and the settler issue. Do you have statistics to show how many settlers have been killed by Palestinians in the West Bank versus the other way? And my second question is, where does the request for 40,000 AR-15s stand right now?
So there are, depending on whether you include occupied East Jerusalem or not, there are 500,000 to 700,000 Jewish Israeli settlers in the occupied territories. And I can't be categorical about